Hello, my name is Alex Zacharias. In this video, I'll be discussing the civil war that happened in Guatemala and the role that the U.S. and the United Fruit Company played in overthrowing of their government and political and economic climate that would lead to destabilizing the country and setting the country on a track of bloodshed and despair for the indigenous community of Guatemala. It is important to note that Guatemala is not the only country in Central South America that has had its natural resources used for monetary gain from Western nations. Countries such as Honduras and Panama, El Salvador, and Colombia have all seen impacts from the banana republics that exist inside of these countries that have led some countries to great consequences in relation to the U.S. In the picture, you can see a dock filled with bananas and the workers who are responsible for exporting the bananas to the dock or exporting them to their destination. Guatemala has a long history of population working in agriculture. 1 out of 3 people currently have found themselves working in agriculture in Guatemala. This is due to a small percentage of the population owning a close to a majority of the land. According to Michael Steinberg and Matthew Taylor on the population impacts of Guatemala, 2% of the population owns 65% of the land and is leased out to outside companies for profit that does not benefit the local economy that Guatemalans need. Land is obviously playing an important factor in the current state of Guatemala, but has always been this way. In the picture shown, you can see 3 girls walking with one of them holding an umbrella above her head. The dirt path they are walking on is completely filled with trash. This is an impoverished area of Guatemala, and the country itself is considered a poor country. But looking at the factors of how it got there is also important. When looking at the history of Central American countries, we begin to see the trend of large plots of land being bought up by Western businesses in the early 20th century. One of these companies being the United Fruit Company, or the UFCO. In the 1930s to the 1940s, the current dictator, Jorge Ubico, started to become a puppet and mouthpiece for the company by leasing 3 million acres to the company and passing bills that required the indigenous population to work for local landowners at least 100 days out of the year. This also included women and children. This is only the beginning of the development of issues that would rig a chain reaction in the Guatemalan politics and economy. As previously mentioned, Guatemala was not the only country that we saw being used for its natural resources, as most countries in Central South America all saw negative effects in their countries due to protests of workers' rights to just have a 6-day work week that brought slaughter and violence on peaceful protesters. When examining the beginning of the Banana Republics, Central America was the first target for companies like the UFCO. In Costa Rica, Panama, Honduras, and Guatemala, these all saw establishments of giant banana plantations where large portions of these countries' populations worked and received inhumane treatment, low pay that can only be redeemed at a select few and inconvenient places that the fruit companies themselves owned. So when discussing any banana republic and its negative effects, it is important to note that most countries in Africa and Central and South America all had a large deal of issues dealing with the U.S.-owned fruit companies. Guatemala has always had a large history of corruption in the government and politics, with past leaders who prioritized companies that didn't do anything but create more hardship for the people of Guatemala. In the photo shown, Jacobo Arbenz is seen being inaugurated into the Guatemalan presidency. Jacobo, unlike his predecessors, had the general public interest and well-being in mind when he became elected. Arbenz, being aware of the dwindling economy, began confiscating large portioned ownerships of land, which would greatly affect the UFCO. The then CIA director caught wind of this and convinced President Eisenhower that Arbenz had to go. On a June day in 1954, a plan to overthrow the government took place, led by Carlos Armas and a group of rebels and a CIA-piloted planes. The capital of Guatemala was heavily bombed, along with 9,000 Arbenz supporters arrested. Carlos Armas took power immediately and returned close to 2 million acres of land to the UFCO, along with outlaying trade unions and other programs that were in place to assist the population of Guatemala. After the coup of Jacobo Arbenz, a mere 6 years later, a civil war in Guatemala would erupt. This civil war would not be short and would last for close to 40 years before things began to slow down. After multiple overthrows of the government and guerrilla groups on the rise to battle the influence of imperialism found in the government, Carlos Arana, who was the current president of Guatemala, would begin to pass laws that would play a vital role in the Civil War. This would mark the beginning of one of the most violent times in Guatemalan history. From 1960 to 1996, over 200,000 Mayan natives were murdered or disappeared. Military dominance was used against every aspect of humanity the natives had. 600 villages were destroyed, crops were torched, livestock was slaughtered, water supply was fouled, and many sacred places were vandalized and destroyed by the Guatemalan government. It is also important to note that we recognize the large number of women who were hurt during this time. During the Guatemalan Civil War, large numbers of indigenous women were sexually assaulted, abused, dehumanized by the hands of death squads and the military. In the photo shown, you can see two Mayan girls dressed in traditional Mayan garments. A substantial amount of the Mayan population was either killed or had to flee Guatemala at this time. With all this extreme violence happening at this point in Guatemala's history, one may ask, what was the driving force behind all this senseless violence? Well, there were multiple factors in play. One of those factors was actually the U.S. government. Operation Sophia was the name of the operation carried out by the Guatemalan government that sought out all the destruction of infrastructure and life as previously mentioned. While the U.S. did not directly orchestrate it, it supported the atrocities by providing military and financial support to the Guatemalan government during the 1980s. The assistance included weapons, training, and funding for the large-scale massacres that they would carry out against Mayan natives. Though the U.S. didn't openly endorse this violence, they made sure the government of Guatemala was able to, after creating a social and political environment in Guatemala that largely affected people's lives dating all the way back to the 1950s. It's bewildering to me how this mostly started from people protesting an oppressive fruit company and government to massive amounts of destruction and loss of life. I'm glad I was given a chance to share the information on this topic, as I feel that this conflict is not often talked about, and the victims who lost their lives still have not received their justice. May the 200,000 indigenous Mayan people who lost their lives during this conflict rest in peace.